It's the dead of night on the mean streets of London's impoverished East End. On one particular street, a man's horse suddenly rears up while pulling a cart. Something has frightened it. The man lights a match and makes a grisly discovery: the body of a woman with her throat sliced from ear to ear. What this man doesn't know is that Jack the Ripper is hiding right next to him in the shadows. If he pricked his ears, he'd probably hear the Ripper's labored breathing, a consequence of just cutting that poor woman's neck. The Ripper should have been seen that night. He should have been caught. In fact, as you'll see in this story, it is frankly incomprehensible that he wasn't stopped in his tracks there and then. The man who made the discovery was named Louis Diemschitz. We'll return to him shortly to explain how close he came to catching the Ripper, but first, let's set the stage for one of the most infamous killers in history. Jack the Ripper is perhaps the world's most famous serial killer, in part because of the mystery surrounding his identity. One of the reasons it was so difficult to catch him was the labyrinthine streets of 1880s London, particularly in Whitechapel. This area, poorly lit and densely populated, was a hotbed of poverty, crime, and vice. The slums of the East End were teeming with people living in abject conditions. When work was unavailable, many turned to crime, while some women took to what's often called the oldest trade in the world. In 1888, Whitechapel alone had 62 brothels and over 1,200 prostitutes. Many of these women lived in lodging houses, the cheapest accommodations available. In some cases, these lodging houses offered little more than a rope to lean on for 2 pence a night. Hence the term, hangover, as people literally hung over the rope to sleep. This was Jack the Ripper's hunting ground, a place where violence and desperation were commonplace. Many of the residents believed the police cared little for the lives of the impoverished, and this indifference may have contributed to the Ripper's ability to operate so boldly. The Ripper's notoriety stemmed not just from his murders but from the horrifying and gruesome nature of his crimes. He is believed to have killed 5 women for certain, the so-called canonical 5, but some speculate he may have murdered as many as 11 people. The first possible victim was Emma Elizabeth Smith, a woman who had fallen on hard times and turned to prostitution. On April 3, 1888, she was brutally attacked. Although she didn't die immediately, she succumbed to her injuries after falling into a coma. However, her case is not conclusively linked to the Ripper, as she wasn't mutilated in the manner of his later victims. Then there was Martha Tabram, another woman who had been drinking heavily on the night of her murder, August 6, 1888. Her body was found with 39 stab wounds, a shocking act of overkill. Like Emma, it's uncertain whether Martha was a victim of the Ripper, as her injuries did not display the anatomical skill evident in his later murders. The first widely accepted Ripper victim was Mary Ann Nichols, known as Polly. She was killed on August 31, 1888. Polly had struggled with poverty, often turning to prostitution to make ends meet. On the night of her murder, she had been seen wandering drunk in the streets after being thrown out of her lodging house for failing to pay. Her mutilated body was discovered at 3:40 a.m., just 10 minutes after her death. The brutality of the crime was shocking. Her throat had been slashed, and her abdomen was mutilated so severely that her organs were spilling out. Experts believed the killer had used a sharp knife and possessed some anatomical knowledge. Despite the brutality and the likelihood that the killer would have been covered in blood, no one saw him. Annie Chapman the Ripper struck again on September 8, 1888. His victim was Annie Chapman, a woman whose life had been marked by tragedy. Following the deaths of her children and her husband, Annie turned to prostitution to survive. At 5:15 a.m. on the morning of her murder, a man walking along Hanbury Street heard a woman scream but did not investigate. Her mutilated body was found less than an hour later. Her throat had been slashed, and her reproductive organs had been removed with surgical precision. Again, the Ripper had escaped undetected, despite committing the crime in a relatively busy area. The night of 2 murders, the night of September 30, 1888, became known as the double event, as 2 murders were committed within an hour of each other. The first victim was Elizabeth Stride. She had been seen with several men that evening, the last of whom may have been the Ripper. At around 1 a.m., Louis Diemschitz, a jewelry peddler, returned to Dutfield's yard with his horse and cart. His horse suddenly stopped, startled by something. Striking a match, Diemschitz discovered Stride's body. Unlike the previous victims, she had only been killed moments earlier, and her body showed no signs of mutilation. It's believed the Ripper may have been interrupted before he could finish his work. Undeterred, the Ripper struck again less than an hour later. Catherine Eddowes, his next victim, was found in Mitre Square with horrific injuries. Her face was mutilated, and her organs had been removed. A piece of her bloodied apron was later discovered nearby, along with a cryptic message scrawled in chalk that read, "The Jewess are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." This message only deepened the mystery and led to rampant speculation. The final act. The Ripper's final known victim was Mary Jane Kelly, murdered on November 9, 1888. Her mutilation was the most extreme, with her body virtually unrecognizable. Kelly's murder marked the end of the Ripper's reign of terror, though his identity remains a mystery to this day. The case of Jack the Ripper is one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. Despite countless investigations, theories, and suspects, his true identity remains unknown. What is certain, however, is that the shadow of his crimes continues to haunt the streets of Whitechapel, a grim reminder of the darkness that once lurked in London's slums.